what I'm going to present today is sort of a concept how we've been able to share clinical trial or data coming out from clinical trial in real time. And the team, these are all the people that are part of PNOC. And I guarantee you, we don't have a gender bias, but it just happens to be that we are majority are really females in our teams right now. But before I start, I really wanted to take a minute to express my gratitude. I'm extremely thankful to be here today and to take on the one of the leadership roles within CBTN. I'm really grateful to Adam and Jay, having started CBTN, now over 10 years ago, and really with this wonderful vision to share the data in real time. I'm very thankful for all the collaborators, the scientists, the bioinformatic people, the clinical research associates making this all happen. But I'm always very humbled being in a room with families and foundations who have been deeply impacted by pediatric brain cancers, and how you are all really driving the mission and to help us improve on the therapy is really constantly inspiring to me. So thank you for that. So just for those who are not that familiar with PNOC, so we started PNOC also now a bit over 10 years ago. Initially, it was a small consortium with 8 sites along the West Coast, and it's called Pacific Pediatric Neuro-Oncology Consortium. But we really shifted over time and now have 22 sites in the United States. And now, as you can see, multiple sites in Europe with the Netherlands and Germany, also in Switzerland, Israel and India, Australia and New Zealand. And now we are finalizing our agreement with Egypt. And I think we are shifting also a little bit our mission. In the beginning, we obviously wanted to develop really biology-driven therapies. And now we're really also aiming to provide access to these innovative therapies. And I think there's a lot of overlap with CBTN. And so just when you think about the enrollments we had over the last years, it's over 700 and growing. And what we are sharing and what Carl has shown in his slides already, that we are pretty good now and really through the push through CBTN and Adam sharing the genomic data. But there's so much more, right? We can share and we want to share. And how do we really make this accessible to the community at large? And just to give you an overview of the different disease entities we are currently offering clinical trials for, it captures a broad spectrum of pediatric CNS tumors. So I think by sharing our data, we can really have an impact how also CBTN can really distribute and make this data available in more real time. But how can we share the data efficiently and effectively without compromising clinical trial endpoints? And I think this is always my biggest worry. So much effort, so much money goes into developing these clinical trials. And obviously, you want to not compromise the endpoints. So obviously, if you share outcome data as the trial is ongoing, you will automatically introduce a bias. Families will have biases, enrolling physician will have biases. But also, sometimes we are dealing with really small sample sizes as part of our clinical trials. So for rare, where we maybe enroll 15 to 20 patients, obviously there's an added risk if we are revealing this information to also reveal patient identification. And I'm always asking myself, we as providers are more worried about this than our families, because they often share all their data on social media platforms. So we have to question if that's really is an issue or is it not. And then obviously, as we entered into these international trials, dealing now with regulations within the European Union, but also other countries, there are obviously very different regulatory frameworks we need to adhere to make sure that still works for the entire consortium. And then obviously the technical integration at scale. I think that is one of the biggest challenges. And without the help really from CBTN, there's no way we would be able to accomplish this. But what are the opportunities with data sharing, right? It supports research beyond the initial scope of the research questions. It's detailed data collection of clinical data. We heard this morning from Angela and from Sarah how challenging it is to really collect good clinical outcome data. As part of a clinical trial, we are obviously collecting a lot. So it's considered right now the golden standard, but I'm sure Angela and Sarah will change this. And then obviously the other bigger portion is also avoidance of duplications, right? Patients are integrated and enrolled in a clinical trial through PNOC. The next trial might be through the PBTC, but maybe they're already a member of CBTN. And how can we avoid that any data that has already collected from this patient in terms of tissue, cognitive data, imaging data can be really harnessed to inform their therapy. And obviously it empowers families and patients. All our families and patients want to share their data. Obviously, the sharing of clinical trial data is not a new concept, right? I mean, I'm just highlighting here one consortium, the clinical study request. That is a consortium of pharmaceutical study sponsoring, empowering data sharing from their clinical trials. There's no cost, it's a request. They have now 3,000 studies within over 100 disease areas. When I looked at the studies, it's very limited on cancer, and there's no pediatric cancer studies that have been integrated into this clinical study data request. But there's a lot of research projects that have already been empowered by that clinical study data request. And when you look at their timeline, so their median time to data access is about 6 months. They have a very vigorous process, how they evaluate the concept, how they make sure the team has the right statistical support to complete their project. I think that was one of the questions that came up earlier during the discussions. So 6 months plus, that's not bad. And I think obviously within CBTN, I think you can be much faster, as Adam highlighted. But also this is only after completion of a clinical trial. So this is not real-time data sharing. And so when I talk to Adam, he keeps telling me that really PNOC is one of the only clinical trial consortium that is currently sharing data from clinical trial subjects in real time. And just to highlight some examples, so many of you are familiar with the study. So this is PNOC 003 that has recently been published, and ongoing is PNOC 008, where we basically used a precision medicine approach based on clear, certified whole exome sequencing and RNA sequencing data to inform a multi-agent therapy plan with up to 4 FDA-approved agents. And then I think one of the challenges we highlighted, right, just having the genomic information at hand is not enough. You need to have really the in-depth discussion between the genomics experts, the clinicians, but also the pharmacologists to then put this data together to then really come up with a treatment plan. And Lindsay, I think, who is here also, she's one of the study chairs. I mean, we have a lot of discussions around this, and then we have to reiterate on a patient depending on their side effects they experience, what are we doing, what do we think, what drug is available. So there goes a lot into this. But then we monitor these patients, and at time of progression, they can re-enter this. And really, this data is being generated by, initially was TGen, and when we started this, we paid about $30,000 per sample. So, I mean, that was a very expensive trial. I mean, obviously, that cost has significantly come down. But then really, through Adam's help and the CBTN, we then were able to outsource this to different companies, and then some of the analysis actually is now being done as part of CHOP. And how you do this really in real time is not trivial. We had hiccups, but I mean, it really empowered the study, and all this data is really pushed in real time to the open clouds that Adam has discussed so that other researchers can obviously make use of it. And so this is basically what I think Angela highlighted, right? We now, but it took us a while, right, to get to the point that genomic data sharing, I think, is feasible. We figured this out. We have example for this, but it's only for a clinical trial consortium such as PNOC, and I think that will be the same for other consortia in the same space. It is all you need to have another partner who really allows you to have access to their infrastructure to do that. And so one of the other project I wanted to briefly highlight, and this is something that is led by Javad Nazarian and Carl Koschman, who you have seen present earlier, but many others really across 7 countries, across 30 research groups, where we basically got a group of researchers together from the clinical side, translational side, imaging side, to really empower research on behalf of children with diffuse midline glioma. And Carl already showed this. One of the first agents we were focusing is ONC201, and I will not repeat this. But one of the trials that came out of this data is PNOC 22, and this is a clinical trial platform design where basically patients can enter the clinical trial at 3 different stages: at initial diagnosis, after they already completed radiation therapy, and then at time of recurrence when they are eligible for a second round of radiation therapy. And so then patients are being randomized to different medicines throughout their medication, and everyone receives a combination therapy. And that was all done and collaborated on between multiple labs, coming up sort of with the best combination therapy that we thought we will move forward to the trial. The statistical design was really led by Annette Molinaro, who will be part of a panel later today, and that was also not trivial. And doing this all in real time, assigning patients, randomizing them. So this study is a lot of work. And as Carl already mentioned, we enrolled in record time really a lot of patients. And I was really excited to see that now we have a study open in Australia, and I expect that Utrecht and Zurich will open up in November as well. And so what we are collecting on the study, in addition what Carl had mentioned, the genomic data, but we are also collecting the microbiome, flow cytometry, other molecular studies. And how do we deal with this data, and can that be shared in more real time to the community? And just to briefly outline another trial that came out of the DMG Act group so far is the assessment of ONC206 that also Carl mentioned, which is PNOC 23, which has a very similar design. And for this, we already enrolled 14 patients, and that's actively open at 2 sites in the US and 1 site in Zurich. And so I'm personally really excited about what Carl had already shown, that we basically can now really push the data that we are collecting and is being generated as part of this trial in real time over to the CBTN and share it with the community at large. And I think as a next step, we need to think about what else can we share, right? Is it the imaging data, for example, we could share? I mean, we're collecting a lot of images on these patients every 2 months. As I mentioned, we are collecting the microbiome, we are collecting other body fluids, we are collecting CSF. And how do we structure the sharing of such data without compromising the clinical trial? And so I love to have ongoing conversations for this, but it was really through Adam and his team who really pushed us from a clinical trial consortium perspective. How can we do this effectively? And I think we found a good way to do that, but there's still a lot more we need to do. And just another example is PNOC 27. This is a study led by Josh Rubin. I think actually Rob Baxler will present about the study tomorrow, so I will only briefly discuss it. But in addition to sort of a similar outline, what I mentioned for PNOC 03 and PNOC 08, where you use this really precision medicine approach using whole exome and whole genome data, this is a trial for recurrent medulloblastoma, for often the driver genes are really not druggable. And so now we are integrating also real-time drug assessments. And so we're developing short-term cultures from these patients, and then they are basically have a screen with 200 plus drugs, and then we are selecting the top hits. And that is another level of data, right? That would be really interesting to share in real time. But here, we only will enroll 10, 15 patients. How do we do this? But so I think there's more to come, but I'm really looking forward on this collaboration around this. And then the other opportunity I think we have, I mean, many consortium now, right, we are thinking about as we are developing these targeted therapies, immunotherapies, right, we really need to understand how our patients do in the long term. And so one of the protocols we've been working on for quite a while now is the PNOC long-term follow-up protocol, where basically patients who enter into a PNOC study will basically enter at the same time in the PNOC long-term follow-up protocol. And then the primary objective of this protocol is to collect comprehensive genomic, epigenetic, transcriptomic immune profiling, and phenotypic data on these children. But in addition, we are also collecting endocrine outcomes, we are collecting ophthalmological outcomes, we are collecting cognitive outcomes. And then we need to start to integrate, right, some of these more functional outcome data into the context of our imaging data, but also into the context of the genomic data. And so some of the data, right, I think there will be a pretty straightforward process like, cognitive computerized measurements, but I think others will not be that trivial. But I think this is a perfect challenge really for the CBTN to take this on. Next, I just wanted to show you one example that Carl also already mentioned, and that is really for non-trial patients. I think as Sarah Leary mentioned, many patients who are actually participating in the CCDI program, they're actually not participating because they want to register into a clinical trial. So one of the projects we are all working with, and I don't know if Jenna's in this room, we had many, many calls about this, and this is the National DMG Tumor Board, which I think serves as a blueprint maybe for other rare entities. So basically what Carl showed, right, we have identified 8 neuro-oncologists across the country. This is not consortia specific, that is open. Then we have 2 dedicated neuroradiologists. We have 1 radiation oncologist from Columbia University who volunteered. And then Sebastian Bosak, who you heard about, basically will be our genomic expert. And that will really provide the sling. If we generate any genomic data or have any genomic data available to us in this tumor board, we also have the expertise for the right interpretation. And then we will do an expert opinion review. We will outline to these patients what is available in terms of clinical trials or outline why you're not eligible for certain trials. So really giving this comprehensive multi-site expert review, which in the end we hope will really reduce the burden on families to have to go to 8 different sites to get their opinions. But in addition, under the leadership of Javad Nazarian, we are aiming to collect longitudinal data on these patients. Most of these patients will have had biopsies, they will get imaging, they will have other biomarkers assessed. And so Javad is now in collaboration with the CBTN putting this together. How can we facilitate this? And how can we facilitate this in the context that as providers, if we give a medical opinion, are a little bit restricted what we can do, but still how do we create this access? So I'm really excited and looking forward how we solve these different working flows, because I do think this will be a nice blueprint for other rare diseases where sort of this genomic integration that is now being generated on pretty much all the children with brain tumors through the CCDI can be then integrated really in the clinical care. And just to end sort of my presentation, so when I think about from an academically led clinical trial consortium perspective, right, we face really technology limitations. We have our set clinical trial database, we have our web-based platforms, how we communicate with each other. We have our imaging platforms, if we do have them. Sometimes it's still sending CDs around for a given trial. And Miriam, who graciously agreed to did all the 01 and 02 analysis, can attest to how complicated it was to get to all the images. And then we love Excel files. We still have Excel files, right? Where our favorite hit or our ctDNA, I mean, it's living in Excel files in 2022. That's unfortunately what it is. And so how do we integrate this? Because currently, right, there's no real integration across these platforms. It's not scalable. We cannot query. There's no connectivity with the medical record system, and it's just really hard, and it is dependent on end users, right? I mean, we have clinical research associates imputing the data, and that is ultimately obviously set to lead to errors. And this is just what normally most clinical trial consortium do, where they have operations team taking care of certain aspects. You have sites who have to input certain data, but I think this is really where we need help. And so when I think about data sharing, families and patients want to share their data. That is not in question. I have really yet to meet a family who doesn't want to share their data. And it is very clear, I mean, I think nobody will question that, if we can share the data in a more timely and efficient manner, that this will lead to better outcomes. I mean, we all learn in kindergarten, sharing is caring, right? I mean, this is ultimately, I think this is not fancy, right? This is common sense, it makes some sense. But then we have these challenges, right? And the partnership that are really needed to leverage existing tools for data sharing. But then if you all agree that data sharing makes sense and will empower new therapies, Why is that still so limited? How can it be that there's might be only one consortium doing this in real time? And I thought about this, and I think it's a lot about trust, right? People who run these clinical trials, who basically invested years of their life to get maybe one trial open, put hours and hours in, they need to trust the system, that the data is handled correctly, that it's shared correctly, but also that they get recognized for their efforts. And if you put your data into a big data repository like the CBTN, maybe your name gets lost, maybe all the hard work. And how can you survive then in academic institution where we are still judged as first author, last author grants in that environment, if you generated all this data, but you're not acknowledged? And I think that is something we really need to consider and put into a framework. How can we develop trust? I trusted because I spent hours with Adam, and it was very clear to me that I can trust him. But how do we do this at scale, right? How do we empower junior investigators, mid-career investigators who spend so much of their time developing these trials that they feel comfortable sharing their data? And I think that's something we really need to solve. And then obviously we need to partner with technology. We heard a lot about this morning about language processing, learning. I mean, there are many hurdles, but I think we need to really embrace this technology to take a step forward. And so with that, I will end, and thank you very much for all of our supporters, funders, and families, and thank you for your attention.